When I say consciousness can exist independently of the brain, I'm not just talking about my experience, which was an absolutely stunning demonstration. Now, of course, to me as a neuroscientist, as a neurosurgeon, this was absolutely shocking and demanded a much deeper explanation. Max Planck and many of the quantum physicists, Erwin Schrödinger, Wolfgang Pauli, um, Pascal Jordan, they were all saying things about the primacy of consciousness, how there seemed to be one mind. And it's not the physical world that is generating the mental, it's the other way around.
Welcome, Dr. Eben Alexander. I'm really glad to have you back. Today, I'd like to talk to you about certain things you've mentioned in your different books, but mostly about the survival of consciousness outside the physical body, non-local consciousness, and a little bit about quantum physics. But I'd like to begin by asking you a simple question. In your first book and also in your other books, you've mentioned that the human consciousness can survive without the brain. Can you tell us why you came to this conclusion and if there are medical studies to support this?
Okay, well, AJ, thanks for having me on. It's great to be back with you again today. In terms of your questions, I mean, to me, my experience was completely impossible according to the tenets of conventional neuroscience, that thinks the brain creates consciousness, and the neocortex is the most important calculator in generating that consciousness. That's all modern, conventional neuroscience. And yet my disease, E. coli meningitis, afflicting all lobes of my brain and my brainstem, did not leave any place in that system for any kind of dream or hallucination to occur. There was too much damage to my neocortex and to the rest of my brain. And then to have that extraordinary experience and then to have a complete recovery. I mean, that's something that really demands explanation. And in fact, that's where I think the medical case report on my medical records is so important. That was written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. And in their paper published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018, these 3 doctors made it clear that my brain was in no shape to harbor any kind of dream or hallucination, much less this extraordinarily rich experience I had. And not only that, but when they were challenged by the peer review editors of the journal, this spending a week deep in coma from E. coli meningoencephalitis, when you went into coma over 3 hours, doesn't allow for recovery. There are no cases like that in the medical literature. And so they demanded, how do you explain this case? And the 3 doctors who wrote the case report said it's because he had a near-death experience. That's what allowed for this profound healing. They knew of other cases, like Anita Morjani's advanced lymphoma that disappeared after she had a spiritual NDE. Dr. Mary C. Newell, who had an over 30-minute warm water drowning. She wrote a book called To Heaven and Back, and she ended up making a full recovery from something, that most doctors would tell you there's no way the brain recovers from that. So it's really kind of this miraculous setting of healing and of wholeness that occurs in these cases that makes them so important to get. And for me, right at the heart of my very experience is this screaming exclamation mark that the brain is not creating consciousness. In fact, your consciousness enriches when you're separated from the brain and body. Now, of course, to me as a neuroscientist, as a neurosurgeon, this was absolutely shocking and demanded a much deeper explanation. And that's why we wrote our 3rd book, Living in a Mindful Universe, which actually brings together so much of the science and spirituality. And that includes not only neuroscience and the hard problem of consciousness, and not only philosophy of mind, but also all the evidence for non-local consciousness out of the world of parapsychology, things like telepathy, remote viewing, after-death communications, near-death experiences, shared death, which are just like near-death, but happen in perfectly healthy people. And then, of course, that entire giant literature, scientifically um, evaluated literature on children who remember past lives indicative of reincarnation. And that literature scientifically is beyond reproach. I mean, you can't just simply say, oh, it's all imagination, it's all made up. There's some very definite and hardcore cases to the tune of 1,700 cases, actually, at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, where they've actually solved the past life memories of a child. That is, they found the person who lived before. So when I say that consciousness can exist independently of the brain, I'm saying actually much more than that, that it's a unified consciousness. The brain serves as a filter, and that all of us are sharing that mind of the universe. So it's a very big and bold set of claims that are derived directly from the empirical data of tens of thousands of these experiences. So when I say consciousness can exist independently of the brain, I'm not just talking about my experience, which was an absolutely stunning demonstration of vivid, phenomenal conscious awareness when a brain was completely inactivated. So it really it's taken me 15 or 16 years now since all this happened, because it was just over 16 years ago that I woke up from this coma. And I've worked with scientists around the world over those 16 years. But the bottom line is the entire scientific community is rapidly getting to a point where they realize consciousness is more of a unified phenomenon that we share. And it's not locally limited to our brain and body and to the here and now, but our consciousness is much grander than that. And that's what my journey showed so clearly. But luckily, there are thousands of other cases like this that help to make the reality, prove the reality that consciousness is something that's much more unified. That kind of God mind is something we all have access to. And this is where I think the scientific world is going through a tremendous revolution. And I'm very glad for any part that I've contributed to that turn towards the truth.
Regarding this unified consciousness, it reminds me of what the founder of quantum physics, or the father of quantum physics, Max Planck, said. He said that there was an intelligent mind, the matrix of all matter, behind the real world. You also, in your Living in a Mindful Universe, talk about this primordial mind, and you also mention it as the collective mind. Can you expand on this, please?
Well, yes. I mean, if you get right down to the basic elements that contribute to that knowledge, you're really talking about tens of thousands of cases of near-death experience, where people describe that as they're in the process of dying, and this can include, people who are dead up to 3 days. I mean, I know of NDE cases like George Rodinea, who was dead for 3 days and then came back to life. So some of these can be very extraordinary kind of death experiences, and then still having the body to come back. But the fascinating thing is that those cases very strongly point to the reality of a God mind. I mean, that's why when near-death experiencers come back to this world, they're no longer afraid of death, because they realize it's not an ending, it's a transition, but it's actually a transition to a higher state of awareness that's much more interconnected with the universe. And that is what is so amazing about NDEs. But of course, that's the picture that emerges from this much larger discussion of conscious awareness. And it turns out that the dying process, that, a physical body dying, is a tremendous catalyst in terms of allowing understanding and knowing, learning, teaching of souls with other souls about their ongoing connection in spite of the death of a physical body. And I think that is what is so important. And especially when you also get into the literature on after-death communications, and you find, as I was told by so many people who attended my talks early on, even before the book Proof of Heaven came out, and many of them would come up to me and say, I've never told anybody this before, but, and then they'd share a story with me that would change the world. I mean, all these similar stories of a loved one who is still connected to them after bodily death and gives them useful information in the here and now. Sometimes it's health information, like you need to go to a doctor, you have a mass in your breast or something like that. So it's not just wishful thinking, but useful information to help us live these lives that comes from these experiences of acknowledging our connection with loved ones, even when they've left the physical plane. And again, important to point out that more than 90% of near-death experiencers, going back across all cultures, belief systems, continents, many of whom were previously agnostic or atheistic, more than 90% come back to this world after their experience, not just having some blind faith, but having a strong belief and knowing of the reality of an intelligent, loving force at the core of the universe. And I came back from my own journey recognizing that that force is very real, but that we often get confused because we're trying to label it according to some predefined assumption or ideological assumption. And we want to call it God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, all the names we've come up with that. But in terms of what near-death experiences are actually showing us, they're showing us the reality and the commonality of that beautiful, infinitely loving God force right at the core of our conscious awareness. I mean, that was something I discovered in the depths of my journey at the core realm, the kind of loftiest sanctum sanctorum of the divine. That's as far as I went on my journey, a complete resolution of all oneness, where the entire universe for all of eternity was this complex oversphere for teaching. In that core realm, it was clear that my conscious awareness was directly sourced in that infinitely loving and co-creative God force of the universe. And you start to realize NDEs are just part of the picture. And then all these other elements like shared death experiences that are similar to NDEs, but happen in healthy people, and also deathbed visions. For example, the writings of Christopher Kerr, Kerr, who wrote a book about 5 or 6 years ago called Death is But a Dream. It's all about his work as a hospice terminal care doctor in Buffalo, New York. So he doesn't care about near-death experiences, but what he finds is in his patients approaching death, they have the very same things happen. Souls of departed loved ones come to escort them over. They relive many of the parts of their life, especially parts where they might have some regret or angst or feel that they have some apology or want to make amends, things like that. It's amazing what happens around the dying process that is so revealing of the kind of healing and wholeness that we can come into as human beings, especially as we acknowledge this much grander aspect of self, that we're not just, birth to death, a physical body, nothing more than that, and that the brain is creating consciousness from chemical reactions and electron fluxes, which leaves really no room for free will. That's one of the problems with conventional materialist thinking is they would scoff at you for claiming to have any kind of free will. Yeah, I think most of us sense that we do have free will in our lives. And I would say that quantum indeterminacy, as you pointed out earlier with Max Planck and many of the quantum physicists, Erwin Schrödinger, Wolfgang Pauli, Pascal Jordan, they were all saying things about the primacy of consciousness, how there seemed to be one mind. Schrödinger wrote a beautiful essay in the 1940s about the one mind. And in fact, that's where our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, goes, is to saying that the one mind hypothesis, that God mind is right at the core of our conscious awareness. It's another way of saying that the philosophical position we're talking about here is evolutionary panentheism, not just idealism, which posits that mind rules over matter, which all the evidence is showing us pretty clearly, but we can go beyond that. And that panentheism is this notion that God force is right at the source of our conscious awareness. And not only that, but the evolutionary part of panentheism says, yes, free will is absolutely active in this universe. Sentient beings are steering their unfolding reality through their actions and thoughts and beliefs and attitudes. And all these mental constituents contribute to the emerging physical reality. And it's not the physical world that is generating the mental, it's the other way around. And that's why Karen and I often say it's spirit over matter, not just mind over matter. And spirit just implies that this thing we call mind is really unified. It's that God mind that presents through each and every one of us. But we're given the gift of free will to interact and to contribute to the evolution of consciousness itself, which I think is what's going on here.
In Living in a Mindful Universe, you talk about the supreme illusion, which is more or less what the ancient Hindus said when they talked about Maya, right? So this is a big illusion, right?
Exactly. And the supreme illusion is really just a recognition, an acknowledgement of a fact. And that fact is that although I sit here and I look around this beautiful world, I see the trees and the clouds and the moon in the sky and all this beautiful world around me, never forget that what you're truly experiencing is within your mind. It's a model of something that's supposed to be out there. And yet quantum physics has been screaming at us for the better part of a century that there is no objective physical world independent of the observing mind. And that is what is so important about this notion of the supreme illusion. And as Karen often reminds me, Karen's my partner. She's the co-author of book Living in Mindful Universe. We were recently married. Karen and I have been working for more than 13 years developing all these concepts. And she always teaches me, as above, so below, as without, so within. So this extraordinary set of reminders that what I'm experiencing is a mental model of something. And there's a tremendous amount of influence that my free will has on how that model evolves. So it's very important to kind of open ourselves to the reality that we are indeed captains of our soul and kind of direct where this world is unfolding. And one of the biggest mistakes you can make is to reduce yourself to the little ego mind, the little voice in the head. And I love how Michael Singer in his book, The Untethered Soul, calls a voice in your head your annoying roommate. Very good observation. And it's nothing more than that. And this is why I also recommend people get into meditation, centering prayer, exploring consciousness. It's something I realized, within 2 years of waking up from my coma, that I wasn't just going to read all the books and figure it out. I had to explore conscious awareness. And that's why I started about 2 years post-coma. So going on now about 14 years worth of deep exploration, daily meditations. And for anybody who needs a tool to help to turn off that little voice in the head, I would recommend what I use, Sacred Acoustics, a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. People can go to sacredacoustics.com to learn more. Full disclosure, that's Karen Newell's website. She's my wife. She's my co-author of Living in Mindful Universe, but she's also the co-founder of a company that produces very powerful and effective forms of binaural beat brainwave entrainment to help people get into deep transcendental conscious states of awareness.
You just mentioned that this reality is actually taking place within us, in this mind, in this non-local mind that does not really belong to us. It's more or less like the collective unconscious that Carl Jung mentioned. However, Emanuel Swedenborg mentioned that heaven, also heaven, lies within us. He said the state of our inner nature is what constitutes heaven, and heaven is within each of us, not outside us. So everything is going on within this non-local mind, this collective mind, this universal mind, right? Even
Exactly.
heaven.
I mean, it's simply another way of saying that supreme illusion is very real. This acknowledgement that there's not some physical world out there independent of our observation that exists, that it's all dependent on mind. And that I think is so important. So when people ask me, where is this mind? Where is all that? I would ask you, where is all that physical world you see around you? It appears to be, around you, distributed in space, and you watch it evolve through time. And yet what we recognize is that there are far grander possibilities available to all of us. And the things that happen when you're leaving the physical body at the time of bodily death are demonstrative of this amazing power you have to witness multiple different kind of modes of reality. And I would say we're very used to witnessing this material world, even though I'm saying that there is no objective material world that's independent of conscious observers. And yet, the entire discussion kind of broadens tremendously when you realize the reality of those experiences in the spiritual realm. And what I'm pointing out here is, traditionally what conventional science has done is pretended that all that is just dream and hallucination, NDEs, shared death, after death communication, that it's all just a vigorous imagination. And when you start examining it more closely and finding that there's very real information transfer that's very important in kind of soul growth and understanding and all this, you start to recognize that we need to start taking those other realms seriously. Once you acknowledge, well, it's, a life review, for example, your life flashing before your eyes, it's not a dream or hallucination. When you, for example, look at Bruce Grayson, he's an MD who's a skeptical psychiatrist who studied near-death experiences actively for the last 45 years. I highly recommend Bruce Grayson's recent memoir. It's called After, about all of his experiences. In fact, chapter 10 in his book After is devoted to my case. But the interesting thing to acknowledge here is what he says is, in a review he did of 700 or so life reviews in more than 1,000 NDE cases, is that the life review is a reliving of events, not just a remembering. So we're really kind of shortchanging ourselves if we think, oh, they're just kind of hallucinating this or having vague memories of these distant life events. No, it's a reliving. In fact, 1/3 of his cases said that their entire life was involved in the life review. And these can often happen like in a 10-minute cardiac arrest or something. And people wonder, how can you go through your whole life in a 10-minute time period? Well, the bottom line is, in that realm, it's eternal. You're no longer stuck in this little river of time, of earth time, and this narrative of living these lives, but you're witnessing all the events of your life simultaneously. And the apparent connections become much clearer. That's one of the reasons why an NDE is ineffable or so hard to describe. And the other thing that's especially important to point out about life reviews, according to Dr. Grayson, who studied these extensively for decades, is that something like 75% or so of people say that it's a reliving of events from the perspective of all involved. That's very important. So in other words, it's not just your little perceptions and memories of the events of your life, but you experience them through everyone else that was involved. So if you were busy handing out pain and suffering to others, being greedy, selfish, what have you, in your life review, you get to the receiving end of all that. You get to feel what it felt like. And that's why life reviews in many ways are a beautiful course correction that nudge us gently towards the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. That is written in the fabric of the universe through the life review, where you're experiencing all the events of your life from the perspective of everyone involved. And you get to experience their emotional response to whatever you've handed out to them. And that's why I think my general idea of hell is that people have had life reviews that were especially, kind of unpleasant. That is, maybe they handed out a little too much pain and suffering to others in their life. And then their life review, it was a lot to take. And I don't think there's any eternal hell for souls. I don't think that makes any sense. But I think having a life review, whereas if you've been very bad to others, that you feel what that's like as a form of trying to teach you a lesson about loving others and how loving and compassion and kindness are really the best ways to live our life. That's really what life reviews and NDEs are trying to teach us.
Well, I've interviewed Kathy McDaniel several times, and she had a hellish experience. I'm sure you're familiar with her story. And she said that her experience was co-created according to her background, etc. But there are a lot of people who have NDEs who also say that when they are in that realm, they have the chance to co-create. Do you think people have different NDEs because somehow they are also co-creating their experience?
Well, all that is very true. And I think it is co-creative. I mean, what I came to recognize, when I think a lot of other NDEers come back talking about, is is this sense of that God force as being, it's not a judging external force. It's part of the very creation of our world. So that God force is part of us. It's right there. It's the seed of kind of our conscious awareness. So I think it's very important to get that this God is something that's very much an ally, and helps us to recognize the beauty of dealing out lots of unconditional love, lots of kindness and compassion, mercy, acceptance, every bit of that. And then I'm sorry, your second part you had added. Oh yeah, one thing I wanted to say about that is, people will try and compare the details of each NDE. To me, having had an NDE, realizing how shocking and ultra real it was, when I read other NDE accounts, I could get the same flavor. But I'm not sitting there expecting to find people that are, riding butterflies like I was. I often use the analogy, if we teleported 10 people right now to Paris and we dropped them liberally around Paris and left them there 24 hours and brought them all back, they would all have very, very, very different experiences. You would start to wonder if Paris was one thing or many, many, many things. And heaven, the spiritual realm, is far grander than our material realm. So I'm just pointing out that when you can pick apart little details that you think are significantly different between these accounts, when you experience them with an open mind, especially when you have kind of native organic communications, like when I present to an audience of NDEers, there's an extraordinary kind of increase in the level of information transfer and understanding. One other thing that I often say in my talks, and that is that your prior religious beliefs might flavor the way you tell the story of your NDE, but they do not affect the content is completely independent of your prior religious beliefs. So expect to be surprised. I mean, another statement that's very common in the NDE literature, acknowledged by many of the investigators of these stories, is that people who have NDEs come back more spiritual, but less religious. And I think that's a very important point, not to put religions down, because I think religions can be a very important source of spirituality. I know in my own life, since my NDE, my religious beliefs have greatly expanded beyond anything I was taught in church growing up. And also, some parts of my story completely violated some of what I was taught in the Methodist Church in North Carolina. For example, becoming completely one with that God force, as I did in the core realm, is not a concept I ever would have derived from my religious education growing up. And likewise, the notion of reincarnation. I mean, reincarnation was shown to me in absolutely crystal clear terms. In these visions I had in the core realm and the flying fish vision, and especially what I call the Ender's Net vision, reincarnation, life reviews, every bit of it was a huge part of the evolution of consciousness. And yet that was not a concept that I'd ever been taught before. In fact, I was unaware of all the scientific data supporting reincarnation until after my coma. I had to dig and find that, and then all of a sudden it made perfect sense. In all these discussions of brain and mind and the nature of reality, you start out with this materialism, which was what we were kind of dealt over the last few centuries in terms of science and philosophy and its evolution. And of course, it assumes that only the physical world is there. So that's what you study all the time is physical world, with this assumption that that's the only thing that exists. And in fact, materialist science had come to state in the mid-20th century, that consciousness, beliefs, thoughts, attitudes, none of that had a basis in reality, that it was all just the stuff we could measure. And what they were basically ignoring is the only thing any one of us has ever known is the inside of our own consciousness. We've never known anything else. And again, quantum physics is very clear at demanding that we admit that there is not an objective physical world out there independent of our observation. So all this effort and this kind of angst in quantum physics and in other aspects of neuroscience, philosophy of mind, have been pushing us towards a more general concept of a shared mind, a mind of the universe, and that the brain is serving as a filter. Reducing valve is one term that's been used, transceiver, but that it is allowing us to connect that primordial mind. And that's where all the kind of thinking and mental stuff happens. But it gives us this apparent emerging physical universe. And so the more we kind of get to the details of that discussion and start looking at mind as something that's primordial in this universe and that determines the physical configurations that we witness, then we start to realize the power that our will can truly have. And for me, that willpower is demonstrated especially in healing. So as a doctor, as a physician, I'm very tuned in to, for example, placebo effect for the last 6 or 7 decades. Medicine has acknowledged placebo effect. And that's not just saying a sugar pill can fix your headache, but acknowledging that people's thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes can play a tremendous role in healing them from things like advanced cancers or infections, and doing far better than any medical interventions that we've ever come up with. And then you can move beyond placebo effect into the world of spontaneous remissions. If you put that search term in, go to noetic.org, the Institute of Noetic Sciences website, put in spontaneous remission as a search term, you'll find more than a book they wrote in the mid-90s on more than 3,500 cases of people healing beyond any medical intervention for cancers, infections, et cetera. And then the third major category in terms of mind over matter or spirit over matter and healing and health are these miraculous healings and near-death experiences, like my case, Anita Morjani and her lymphoma, Dr. Mary C. Neal and her over 30-minute warm water drowning. These kind of recoveries are so remarkable. They demand our deepest attention because of the healing and wholeness that's unprecedented. But they involve a spiritual journey. They involve that NDE account. And this is why I encourage people, get into meditation and centering prayer. You don't have to wait for your own NDE to get this. You can cultivate it and start developing a relationship with that primordial mind through meditation and centering prayer, with a regular practice of putting your little ego mind, that linguistic voice in the head, into timeout and allowing the universe to show you what you need to know in the current moment. One of the things that occurs in some of the more unusual near-death experience, or I'm sorry, past life memories, in fact, I'd say it can happen in near-death experiences too, but is coming back speaking a language that one has never been officially taught. Xenoglossy is what it's called. And that basically is showing us how once we tap into this primordial mind, we start accessing all kinds of possibilities that we normally don't think of as being within our purview, unless we take the time to study, for example, a language. And yet people can come back from an NDE with xenoglossy, speaking a different language. And there's certainly some cases in the past life memories in children where people would speak a language that they'd never been taught. It's kind of like these situations of uprushes of genius that are very difficult to explain, like Ramanujan, the famous Indian mathematician, who was self-trained in the tiny little village in India, and how he came up with mathematical concepts that still today, even though he died, probably close to a century ago, these mathematical concepts are so advanced. So tapping into that primordial mind in the many different ways we can do it, whether it's NDEs or past life memories or what have you, can be a way of acquiring entirely new knowledge. So this kind of genius uprushing, things like that. I think the more we study this primordial mind and get into meditation and centering prayer and trying to connect with that primordial mind, the more we'll start discovering the great possibilities we all have for growth, understanding, kind of enhancement of our relationships, and just a much grander view of self when you start getting into the higher soul view of self and not just the ego-limited piece. But the ego basically uses fear and anxiety as its main tools. So many people in our modern world are living kind of at an ego level of consciousness, which is a fairly sad situation. It'd be good to rise above that. It's very liberating for each and every one of us to grow into that higher soul that's much more focused on the higher good and really taking care of all of our fellow beings, the least, the last, and the lost. I mean, that's something that in our very polarized world, we've lost sight of. And yet I'd say it's a very important ingredient for our moving forward is taking much better care of each other. That's one thing that this one mind hypothesis that emerges so strongly from a lot of this literature argues is we really should get along much better than we do. And this false sense of kind of polarization and separation is a leftover from outmoded materialist thought. The scientific community has basically rejected materialism. They did that in 2022 with the giving of the Nobel Prize in Physics for entanglement. Entanglement is that demonstration of spooky action at a distance of the interconnection between subatomic particles that can be light years apart, but when they're generated in a common process, they continue to demonstrate behavior as if they're one particle. And entanglement is one of the most dramatic kind of examples of the reality of the mental universe that's interconnected across space and time in ways that don't make sense from a four-dimensional space-time perspective, but explain so much more about human experience, and especially things like life reviews, after-death communications, all these extraordinary kind of ultra-rich forms of communication soul to soul.
Well, amazingly, this one mind hypothesis was mentioned by the ancient Hindus in the Vedas, the Upanishads, also by the Taoists when they talk about the Tao, the one. And this seems to be like the basic common root of all religions or all true spiritual paths. You know, we are one. This division or individuality is an illusion, and this world that we are living is Maya, an illusion. So I think we're reaching that scientifically, right?
It is amazing that, you know, in all this incredible advance in the last, say, 2 centuries in science and philosophy and our understanding of the nature of reality, that ultimately the big answer seems to be converging on what spiritual teachers were promoting thousands of years ago. Oneness, binding force of love. I mean, these are incredibly rich and powerful concepts that are being proven in the modern scientific examination of the brain-mind relationship and the nature of reality. And yet these are the same deep truths that have been promoted by prophets and mystics going back thousands of years. To me, it's fascinating. It's interesting. It's very rewarding, and it's also it brings a lot more meaning to life. And I sometimes quote Steven Weinberg. He won a Nobel Prize for his work in the 60s on the weak nuclear force. And he's quoted at one point as saying, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems meaningless. And it's because he was so focused on all the mechanics of these subatomic particles dancing with each other and not realizing that the giant backdrop of this entire stage of observation was one of will and of the mind. Now, his colleague, John Wheeler, who was on the Manhattan Project, head of physics at Princeton in the mid-20th century, John Wheeler acknowledged this extraordinary role of mind in what he called the participatory anthropic principle, where he made it clear that even considering a photon coming from a distant galaxy that might be gravitationally lensed by an intervening galaxy, observations of that photon, what turns up in the experiment depends on the mind of the observer, and it affects the photon all the way back to its origin. So this is, and he said, to be is to be perceived. When Wheeler was talking about this participatory anthropic principle, meaning the importance of the mind, the human mind in our emergent reality, he knew it was leading towards idealism, towards the primacy of mind in the universe. And I would say we've just been able to move a little beyond that point to acknowledge that this is not just some generalized mind, but that in fact it really is that kind of God mind that NDEers have experienced, that so many other journeyers and mystics over time have experienced. And it's just very, very reassuring because in essence, it basically means the universe has our back, that we can trust that there is a force, a creative force in this universe that is very important in our lives. that also is interested in us. People often use all this discussion to kind of come down favoring, say, Spinoza's God, which was a form of God that Einstein thought was very reasonable, is this incredibly rich intelligence, but they were not looking at that as having a personal kind of connection. And yet I would say modern NDEs and the study of the science of consciousness in the modern era really leads us deeply towards acknowledging that God force, that Spinoza's God that they see emerging from the scientific evaluation of our assessment of reality, actually has a much deeper connection to us. That's what that NDE component is all about. When you recognize life reviews and you recognize kind of the love that force seems to have for us. That's the thing that's so reassuring and comforting, is that sense in that realm that you're in your spiritual home. It starts seeming very familiar. And this is another reason why I encourage people to get into meditation and centering prayer, which for me, those are the same thing. But it's the more we have experience to this kind of exploration of that one mind across space and time, and as it intersects with all of our fellow beings and with the universe at large, with our shared meaning and purpose, that one mind becomes a very obvious, aspect of who we are. And then it's part of our interconnection. And you start realizing that this is never about an individual soul, but it's about all of spirit and soul evolving together. And we're much more connected through that spiritual realm than we seem to be through the material realm. And yet, ultimately, it's a deep, fundamental connection that has to do with the primacy of consciousness itself.
Regarding this universal mind, one of the pioneers of quantum physics, Wolfgang Pauli, met with Carl Jung, and they did a study on this, and they called the unus mundus, or the one world of oneness, the basic origin both of the material world and of the psychic world.
I say the one mind is like a giant diamond, and each facet of that diamond is a sentient mind, that's participating in learning and teaching and interacting to contribute to the evolution of consciousness, evolution of the one mind. But so by being parts of it, we're parts of it, but we're also the whole, the holographic principle, where the whole is reflected in the parts and vice versa, I think is a very active principle when it comes to mind and comes to the universe. That very concept was made clear to me by a 1991 book by Michael Talbot called The Holographic Universe. And I highly recommend that book. It's extraordinary and insightful. And he talks about the hologram of the universe and the hologram of the mind. And then from my reading of it, he shows how the two really overlap beautifully. And we're talking about one hologram, and it's really that oneness is kind of what we are and who we are. This false sense of separation from others just contributes to our ability to be a sentient being participating in this beautiful dance of existence. But ultimately, we should never forget that we're all here interconnected through that mental space, through a binding force of love.
Well, thank you, Dr. Eben Alexander. This was a really enlightening conversation. I really appreciate you being here.
Well, AJ, thanks so much for having me on again. It's great to be with you, as always. And people can stay up with me at ebenalexander.com. That's EBEN Alexander.com. Learn more about the meditations at sacredacoustics.com. And also innersanctumcenter.com, INNER sanctumcenter.com is a very good resource for other channels of ways to stay in touch with us, ways to see interviews we've done over many years, etc. There's a lot of material there at innersanctumcenter.com.
This has been the A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.